We're going to start with a presentation from Michael Seibel on how startups should approach raising capital, informed from his time as both a founder and as a VC. And for those of you that don't know Michael, he is the CEO of Y Combinator. He was the co-founder and CEO of Justin TV and SocialCam. SocialCam sold to Autodesk in 2012. Justin TV became Twitch TV that sold to Amazon in 2014. Before getting into startups, he spent a year as a finance director at a US Senate campaign, and he graduated from Yale with a BA in political science. So let's welcome Michael to the stage.
All right. I'm going to try to make this dry and informative. So we're going to talk about raising money and why you should listen to me. So the reason why is not because I've raised money before or I work at YC with early stage companies. I actually got a lot more educated about raising Series A specifically after YC created a Series A program to try to help YC founders raise Series A's. And many of my understandings came from that program giving advice to our founders and then seeing what happened. YC companies raised 100 Series A's last year, and so we got a lot of practice really quickly. Here is the meat of the presentation. It's right up front. There are two processes that work well for raising a Series A. A preempt process. By preempt, we mean a process whereby before you start formally pitching, you already have a term sheet or aggressive amounts of interest in hand. And then a parallel process. This is a process that's more traditional, that you've probably heard about. Warm intros, pitch a lot of people simultaneously. Surprisingly, over the past, I'd say year to year and a half, we're seeing far more deals than we ever saw previously happen through the preempt process. Put another way, Series A investors have gotten a lot more aggressive about trying to give early stage companies term sheets before they run the full process. And so it's helpful to talk through what that looks like. So for founders who want to run a preempt process, the first thing you have to keep in mind is that you start this process 1 year to 6 months before you raise a Series A. And for a lot of founders, this is really hard to do. They have a mental model that they should go start fundraising when they need the money. It's exactly the wrong mental model. So it works like this. You start by building a relationship with 3 to 6 partners at VC funds. This requires you to actually research the partners who invest in your space and distinguish them from the partners who don't. This is something that I was horrible at as a founder. I did not want to spend any time on VC's websites, which was not helpful. The second thing you do is what we call coffee updates. These are fun meetings that happen without a deck, outside of the office of the VC, where effectively you're talking to the VC about the major challenges in your business, but also slipping in the fact that things are growing and doing well and so on and so forth. Different VCs have different preferences for how often these meetings happen. Oftentimes, it's really graded by like how much progress you're making. So if you're making progress really quickly, doing them quarterly is perfectly fine. If you're on a slightly slower pace, doing it biannually is also fine as well. Through the process of doing this, some VC gets informally interested enough that they start doing one of two things, either begging you to come in and pitch, or actually in a lot of cases, and this is something people don't talk about, just giving you a term sheet. Then, once you have kind of some real demand in hand, you then make the decision, do I spin up the process with the other 2 to 5 partners that I've been talking to, and or do I extend it to other firms who might be interested? This is the preempt process. I think this, or some version of it, represents over 50% of the deals that YC companies did last year. And it's rarely talked about. Number 2, This is the parallel process. This is the process that's written about all the time. This is the process that you should already know about. This is the process that most people know to do and then don't do, is what it is. So a warm intro to some number of firms. There are many theories. Some theories say it should be 20 plus firms. Other theories say it should be a small number, 6. Fundamentally, though, those intros are also to the actual partner who's interested in your space, not just to some associate or some random person. Piling all of the first pitches into a 1 to 2 week period of time. A big issue that founders have is running a non-parallel process, running a serial process, where the first pitch is this week with one investor, next week with the third, next week the fourth. They're not all batched together. Driving that process to a first term sheet, so effectively not only being aggressive in the initial scheduling of the meetings, but also be aggressive in the follow-up meetings, the follow-up till you get to the first term sheet, with the goal of closing within 1 month. So let's be clear. These two things, like that's the meat. These are the things that you need to do to raise a Series A. Let's talk about something far more interesting. Many companies will fail to raise. YC stats point out that around 70% of the folks that get into YC will not raise a Series A. Series A is the first grand culling of the startups. I would say that nowadays there's a lot of money in seed, and so reasonable team, reasonable idea, reasonable progress, you can raise seed funding. There has not been an explosion in the number of firms that do Series A's, and certainly there has not been an explosion in good firms. And so this is the culling, and so you should go into this aware. Second, running out of money doesn't mean you're ready to raise. Here's a hint, usually it means you're ready to die. And so if you are strategizing your Series A fundraising around when you're going to run out of money, you're doing it wrong. Most companies raise their Series A when they have more than 6 months of funding. In fact, the best founders raise their Series A typically when they have a large portion of their funding still in the bank. This gives you leverage over the process. You have to think about fundraising as leverage, and if I, as a Series A investor, can wait 1 month and your runway has reduced by 20%, well, fuck, I should wait 1 month, right? My leverage goes way up. So this whole idea that like you fundraise when you need money, just wrong. It's much easier to fundraise with product market fit. If any of you have raised seed rounds between $1.5 and $3 million, one thing that you have to understand is that used to be a Series A 10 years ago. And so the amount of progress that investors are expecting is way more than just we launched the product. And a lot of times the failure case that we see is you take that 1.5 to 3, you build a 10-person team, you start burning $150,000 a month, and then fast forward 12 months, you're not blowing up and you're running low on money and you think now is the time to raise a Series A. That is usually the death story of most startups. That's the death story. So, what is product market fit? 97% of the time that your peers say the words product market fit, what they're saying afterwards is a complete lie. Complete lie. The kind of colloquial definition, which is incorrect, is some vague notion of, I think I've built something that people want. Right? And if I ask all of you out here to raise your hand if you think you've built something that people want, most of you will, because that's the nature of being a startup founder. Product market fit is the result of building something people want. And so this is what it looks like. You stop talking about building new features. Your product is breaking because of the usage. Instead of waking up in the morning and being afraid because no one's using your product, you wake up in the morning and you feel even worse because too many people are using your product. You have positive margins. money is increasing in the bank, you know you need to hire more people and you don't have enough time to. And you generally feel worse than how you felt when you were a seed stage company and no one was using your product. Here's the hint, you feel worse, a lot worse. It feels really bad to hit product market fit. And I'll tell you why, I'll tell you the psychology of it, right? Pre-product market fit, you kind of feel bad because no one's using your product, but like also on the other hand, you realize that for almost every other startup, no one's using their product either, right? So you kind of feel like this welcoming glow of group mediocrity. Post-product market fit, you start having this feeling like, oh shit, this is my game to lose. I have done something, it is working, and I could screw it up. And so the way that Emmett, my co-founder, describes this is pre-product market fit, it's like you're pushing a boulder up the hill. When you hit product market fit, the hill crests, and now you're chasing the boulder down. And like, interestingly enough, like, in that description, I think the cool thing is that like, the second one actually feels scarier. Because if the company gets away from you, you lose. So, it's not required to have product market fit to raise Series A's, by any means. It's just helpful. If you can get there, it's really, really helpful. So, some questions you should ask yourself about whether are you ready to raise Series A. Remember, the question isn't, am I running out of money? That's not on here at all. Are new investors asking to invest? So, in my last company, I had this interesting experience at SocialCam where we were doing really well. So every single investor wanted to talk to us. However, on the flip side, we know we weren't doing that well. So we were putting ourselves in a position to sell. And so I kind of used this time as a case study, talking to all these Series A investors who would never touch Justin TV, but who are all over us. And one of the questions I asked them straight up was, what percentage of deals walk into your front door that you've never heard of before versus what percentage of deals do you chase? 80-20. 80% of the deals the VC chases. In some ways, the VC's job is to be a hunter and you're the prey. In some ways, when the VC is not hunting, they feel like maybe quality isn't there. So it's something you should kind of keep in mind. Are new investors asking you to invest? And what's funny is that when an investor really wants to invest in your company, it is unmistakable. We had an investor who wanted to invest in SocialCam, and we did not want to take his money at the time. And he emailed us, or his assistant emailed us every day for 3 months. That's pretty good, right? It is unmistakable. It does not look like, hey, let's meet up in a couple weeks. It does not look like, hey, that was a great update, keep me updated. It looks like they are bothering you in an infinite amount. The second big hint, are your current investors asking to re-up? Right, your current investors, the ones getting the investors updates, the ones who you're talking to, if they're asking to give you more money, that's a really good sign. Really, really, really good sign. Third is, have you hit a significant milestone? Product market fit's a significant milestone. A technical milestone if you're doing more hard tech or biotech. Some inflection if you're doing a social product, some inflection in the growth. If you're doing a B2B SaaS product or an enterprise product, some ARR or MRR target. Something that's going to make people take notice and potentially be afraid to not talk to you. And then the last one is, are you continuing to grow? One of the things we say a lot at YC, and that applies in this process as well, is that because fundraising takes time, there's this constant check-in. And so if your numbers look great as you start the process and then flatten during the process, you might find the process slows down to a halt faster than you would expect. So you have to continue to grow or continue to make progress through this. Another reason why it's helpful to start when you're not running out of money. Okay. Let's talk about telling a compelling story. This is something that Justin is one of the best people at, period. And so I stole some of his points, which I think are really good. The first is no jargon. We say this a lot to companies. They need to have an investor pitch and a customer pitch. And if you're especially an enterprise company and you're selling to some chief innovation officer, the language you have to use to communicate to them is like not even English. It's just some weird gobbledygook of MBA jargon. But you have to use that language. That's the language they speak internally. That's the language they respond to. You can't bet that the VC you talk to is going to be conversant in the same language. A lot of founders want to condense the customer pitch and the investor pitch down to one pitch, easier to remember. Exactly the wrong thing to do. You need the investor pitch to be jargon-free. What's interesting is that a lot of times founders make the mistake of the investor doesn't even really know what you do before you try to sell them. The easiest way to sell an investor is within the first 30 seconds, they actually have a very clear understanding of what you do. That usually involves being jargon-free. The second and third, I think, are really interesting. In some weird way, I think what I've mentally reduced investment down to is telling an investor a story of what the future is going to be and backing it up. And in fact, by giving you money, it's basically saying, I believe in your version of the future. And so I think a lot of times what founders feel like is they feel small and they feel like they're in this kind of sea of stuff going on that they don't control. I think actually the best pitches are when founders basically speak to how their company will shape the future. So you're an active creator of the future. Those are the types of founders and companies that investors really are excited by. So explaining what the future is going to be like 10 years from now, let's say that we were pitching Google back in the day. Let's say it's 2000. Right? Google is going to basically tell a story about how search engines will be the dominant products, will be the dominant business model for the internet within 10 years. That is a controversial story in 2000 when search engines felt like they were a dime a dozen. But they're going to tell that story. The second is explaining why that'll be the case. Right? That's really, really, really important. Being able to explain that the reason why that's going to happen is because the internet provides an explosion of products. And these portals that are trying to create all of the products in-house are never going to be able to compete with folks who are actually trying to do that single product better than anyone else in the world. It's going to be an explosion of products, and finding products is going to be the number one thing that people are going to need to do. Talking about how big that could be is also ridiculously important. Investors, the math I often do is that if your company sells for $1 billion, all else being equal, the partner who funded you and who has to spend 8 years on your board is probably going to make $5 to $10 million. That's for 8 years of work. That's not why VCs get into this business. The difference between your company selling for $1 billion and selling for $10 billion is the difference between making 5 to 10 versus 50 to 100. That's a big difference. And so you need to be able to communicate how this can be huge, right? If we were to tell this in the context of Atrium, step 1 is dominating the startup legal system, right? Step 2 might be dominating the tech legal infrastructure. And then step 3 is going to have to be going after just all legal, all corporate legal. And if you could start telling a story that big, then investors start thinking to themselves, well, the odds of any company being successful are low, but they're trying to make something that I could conceivably think could be a $10 to $100 billion business. So if they do succeed, I'll make a lot of money. Like, that's the math. Comfortable with shitty odds as long as the outcome can be huge. So you want to pitch that big vision of what this could be. And then finally, your deck and your traction is just supporting material. It's just the thing that kind of backs up that you know what you're talking about. Just because a company gets to 150K MRR, there's no reason to believe that's going to turn into 3 million MRR in the next 3 to 4 years. Many companies get to 150, very few get to that 3 million. And so most of this is the story you're telling, with the backup being the evidence. What's interesting is that, when Justin pitched Atrium, what was so fun was that it was a human conversation. too often I think founders feel like this process involves hiding behind a deck. And the deck is the main product. The deck is only the supporting material. If you're going to tell a story and a narrative, you want them looking at you, not at your slides. So, one thing that's also clear is that founders do not practice enough. And I think the reason why is actually pretty simple. One, fundraising isn't easy. In fact, it's kind of really hard, and maybe in some ways needlessly hard. And two, founders feel as though, especially CEOs, feel as though their primary focus should be on their customer and on their product. So why should I take time away from my customer and my product to do this really well? I'll tell you, though, that like some percentage of you will invest the time and you'll get a better result. A much larger percentage of you will not invest the time and you will not get a good result. This is an area where practice actually helps a lot. So, when you're thinking about practicing, this is what you should be thinking about. One, you need to test those narratives. We talk about how this thing could be huge. When you say that to people, do they believe you? Or do you have to say it differently? Second, you got to practice confidence. Having enough knowledge about your space and enough times telling your story, you just say it better. And it's so weird, right? Like, how much of this comes down to confidence? How much, whatever you can put in your deck, is not enough evidence to convince someone to give you $5 to $10 million? It's just not. But the investor knows that you can't make that much more progress. There isn't any more evidence that you can present. So much of this is actually, when I sit down with them for an hour, do I really believe them? Like, so much of it is gut, and like, that's uncomfortable, but it's the reality. A lot of it is gut. So being confident is a huge step towards someone being like, I could follow this person. And in a weird way, that's kind of what you're asking the VC to do. You're almost asking them to become your employee. You're saying, I'm going to give you money, I'm going to follow you down this path, I'm going to help you down this path, but you're the leader. Oftentimes, I think that founders go into that meeting thinking that the VC is the savior, the VC is the leader, the VC is going to be the one who guides them. Nobody wants to give $5 to $10 million to a company that they have to then go and run. The next one is you need to be able to ID your tough questions. Every one of your business has soft spots. It's impossible for you not to have soft spots early. Hell, these companies have soft spots when they're huge too. You need to be conversant in what those soft spots are, and you have to be able to speak to them. You don't need to necessarily have some answer that convinces me it's not a soft spot, but if I catch you by surprise, right? Let's say you're building Postmates, and I'm like, you've got radically negative unit economics here, don't you? If you're like, I don't know what you mean, well, it's really bad, right? If you're like, yes, we track our unit economics very closely, and today, because we're just starting, we're accepting low unit economics, but if you look at this cohort of users who have stuck with us for a really long time, you see the unit economics actually flip, right? You're addressing the big issue, the knockdown issue, instead of avoiding it. The next one is learning your numbers. I always think, like, in this situation where you're basically trying to build quick rapport with a person who's effectively a stranger, there are all of these like cheats to make you look smart. And like being an expert in your own product is the easiest cheat. There are 10 numbers that affect or run any business. And if you have those numbers memorized at all times, and you can just like put them out, just involuntarily people will start thinking, wow, this person just knows their numbers. And weirdly, that makes you seem more credible. Now, I would also argue knowing your numbers makes you better at doing your business, but even if it didn't, it's just easy points. On the flip, if I'm like, oh, what'd you do in revenue last month? And you're like, oh, I don't know. It is such a red flag that you're just losing infinite points. Even if a lot of times founders will say, I don't know, because they're like, well, I know we did between 50 and 55K, but I don't know the exact number. And it's like, just say 50 to 55K, it's totally fine. So this is just a big one, like just learning your numbers. And so going through the process of practice basically will force you to learn your numbers. And the last one is to learn your style. Some people are going to pitch in a more bombastic way. Some people are going to be more reserved. Some people are going to be more comfortable standing. Some people are going to be more comfortable sitting. Like, when you go into the meeting with an investor, you should feel like you're sitting in a warm seat, like you've done this before. You should feel like you've run through this 20, 25 times. The number of people that Justin pitched before pitching the first investor for Atrium was massive. I forgot the number, it was like massive. And that worked so well, considering there was no product when he raised a Series A. So, who to practice with? Current investors are a big one. Current investors are a really, really big one. Hopefully all of you have angels, and in this kind of world, it's extremely common for an angel to want to do a bridge or to do a re-up or to do some more investment in one of their companies that's good. Because they know kind of post-Series A, it's much harder to get in, and it's much higher price. And so they are actually these amazing tools for you to figure out whether you're ready. Because if your angel investors who know you best and who've gotten the updates are not interested in giving you more money, why would you think that new people who don't know you as well are? So, great group. Second great group is angels who might be interested in investing. Once again, they're motivated because they know post-A, it's a lot harder and a lot more expensive to get in. For you, it's an easy group to pitch, because if you want to raise Series A, you don't really want to raise much money from them. So it's this perfect match of like, they're desperate, and you can practice. So really great. And then friends who've raised a Series A, I think is the third group. Generally, I'm extremely skeptical of getting advice from peers. And the reason why is that in this game, so few companies are successful and so many are trying to be, that your average peer is going to fail. And I always like to equate this back to sports. Like if Michael Jordan's trying to figure out how to be Michael Jordan, there's no teammate he can ask. Like no teammate is going to do what he did to get as good as he did. What I will say to you, though, is that your friends who've at least raised a Series A have gone through it before. So they can actually give you better, even just emotional support. They can give you, some semblance of what their experience was like. I also want to talk about this really important point. You run the fundraising process. You are the primary agent. And this is something that took me a really hard time to realize. When I did my first company, I was in my 20s, and these VCs just felt like they were the kings of the valley. And only through much more time being in the valley do I realize that they're actually not that important at all in the scheme of things. The founders are far more important than the investors. And great founders see these people as tools, not in a bad way, but just as a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. And so when they go out to raise money, they run their process. The process is not run on them. So what do I mean by that? One, you decide when to pitch. You decide when your fundraising process starts. If I'm a VC and I say, oh my God, you're so interesting, do you want to come up and pitch us, right? We'd love to get the pitch. Well, if you don't want to start pitching right now, then the answer is no. One thing that Gustav, one of the YC partners, says, which I love, is that one of the surest signs that investors are interested in investing in you is that someone expresses interest in investing in you. Whereas founders take that to be the opposite. If someone expresses interest in investing in them, they think to themselves, oh my God, this might be the only one who will ever be interested in investing in me. So I better just do whatever the hell they tell me to do to try to get that money. It's the exact opposite of what you should be thinking. So you decide when to pitch. You decide who to pitch to. If an investor is like, hey, actually I'm the person for your space, but I'm too busy, or I don't want to talk to you, or yada yada, but do you want to talk to my associate? You decide whether to pitch that associate or not. You decide who gets to learn about your company and who doesn't. If there's someone that you don't like, don't pitch them. You decide how much to raise. This is a big one. Series A's are dilutive. Many seed rounds are also very dilutive. One of the biggest complaints of YC companies is, oh, well, we wanted to raise 5, and then, through this whole process, suddenly we raised 10, and we looked up, and after the option pool and everything else, post-Series A, we now own 40% of the company. Extremely common. So you need to be the one who determines how much you want to raise and what you want to do with it. And let's be clear, more money is often equivalent to more dilution. Weirdly, not more progress. It's really strange. One of the things we've seen at YC is that, back in the day, raising a $200,000 to $300,000 angel round was considered good job. Now that's $1 million to $2 million. You would think that the companies raising $1 million to $2 million have far more progress than the ones 10 years before, and they don't. All they have is more employees. That's it. That's all they have is more of. They don't have more progress, they don't have more revenue, nothing. And in a world that fundamentally is easier to build things now than it was 10, 15 years ago. So you decide how much to raise. You need to ask tough questions too. You'd be so surprised at how many questions the founders will ask us, their group partners, and we will say, why aren't you asking that to your investor? Tough questions is a sign of sophistication, right? Hey, you invested in this company. There's a world where they could be a competitor of ours one day. What do you think about that? That's not a question for your advisor. That's a question for the partner you're pitching. There are a lot of other tough questions as well, right? Like, hey, we believe that we should have an option pool this size. You're proposing an option pool this size. Why? Hey, we think it's ridiculously important for us to maintain control of the company as founders through at least Series C. How do you think we should best do that? These are all questions that, one, show that you're sophisticated, and two, allows you to see whether the person across the table is on the same page or not. So if you prioritize, or if you appear to be prioritizing money above all else, it will come off that way. And if you appear to be prioritizing having a great partner above all else, it'll come off that way as well. And the last thing is that term sheets are negotiable. We've had so many companies who, I've just seen so many dirty tricks here. One trick I saw from a very well-known firm was that the partner was negotiating with this company to do an early Series A, like $3 to $4 million, and it was getting close to Christmas. And the company was like, hey, let's just wait till after Christmas to figure this all out. And the VC says, no. Why don't you come to our office 2 p.m. Christmas Eve? I was like, that's weird. Then when they're at the office, the VC presented a term sheet and said, if you leave without signing this, the deal's off. Right? So, one, that's an extremely douchey move. Two, you have to ask yourself, is that the kind of partner you want? Right? But three, you run the process. If they want to invest in you, you can literally tell them, you know what, thank you so much for the offer. We're going to take all Christmas to think about it. And walk the fuck out. Because you run the process. The process doesn't run you. So what did this company do? They talked to their lawyer, not Atrium, horrible lawyer, who said some version of, if you sign the term sheet but you don't date it, it's not enforceable. Hans, what do you think? Is that A+ legal advice? Yeah. And so then they called me on Christmas Day. I was on vacation with my family. They briefed me on the whole situation for 30 minutes, and only afterwards did they say, oh yeah, well, everything you're telling us, does it matter if we already signed the term sheet? And I'm like, yeah, it does. You're kind of fucked. And fucked they were. That was the deal they got. So term sheet is the beginning of a negotiation. I don't care what it says on it. It could say it explodes in 1 minute. I just ignore that part of the term sheet entirely. It's the beginning of negotiation. Making an investment is basically a binary decision from an investor. Yes, no. Do I want to be in or do I not want to be in? Once they've kind of got the yes, no, then they start thinking about amount of money, price, blah, 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 all that stuff. But fundamentally, if they're on the yes train, you can negotiate. Because fundamentally, whether you realize it or not, at the point where they've said yes, they're selling you. And what the best investors will do is make you feel like you're still selling them after they've already decided to invest. They'll say weird things like, well, our firm has these hard and fast rules that we have to at least own 30% of your company after Series A. That's a lie. Just fucking lie. Or like, well, next week is really, really busy, so like we really would like to get this deal done in the next 2 days. That's a lie, right? They want to get the deal done in the next 2 days because that limits the chances of getting other people giving you offers and negotiating. One of the things I often talk about is that there are 3 things an investor can do to be really good. They can source deals, they can decide to invest, and they can close. It turns out that the one thing that an investor can practice more than anything else is closing. Closing is the thing they can practice over and over again. Whether they're sourcing good deals or not, they don't know that for a while. Whether they're making good investment decisions, they also don't know that for a while. But they sure as hell know, what's my percentage of I decided yes, and then I got that deal done. And so they practice how to close. And if you're being closed, understand a well-practiced machine is being acted upon you. And so you need to know that and be resistant. Okay, that's the whole presentation. I will go back to this thing here. These are the 2 most important slides. Preempt process, parallel process. Most people do not do either. They do the third thing, which is called a serial process. Whenever an investor wants to meet with them, they go and start pitching. That is the worst way to raise money. It rarely works at all. All right, thank you so much. Happy to do questions.